In June 1941, the most powerful army in the world smashed its way into the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was on, and the Wehrmacht's Panzer division seemed like an unstoppable force of nature, a steel tide crushing everything before it. German confidence, their tactics, their technology, it was all at its peak. But then, on a dusty road in Lithuania, German soldiers met a monster they didn't even know existed. Their anti-tank guns, weapons that had knocked out every enemy they'd ever faced, were suddenly useless. Their shells just bounced off. This is the story of the tank that sent a wave of panic through the Panzer divisions, the KV-1. For the average German soldier in 1941, the war so far had been one victory after another. They'd steamrolled through Poland, France, and the Balkans with terrifying speed. They had faced heavy tanks before, but they'd always found a way to win. So when they crossed into the Soviet Union, they expected to meet thousands of outdated tanks and poorly led crews. What they didn't expect was the Kliment Voroshilov tank, or KV.
So where did this beast even come from? Its story really starts not in 1941, but on the battlefields of the Spanish Civil War. Soviet observers there realized that the era of fast, lightly armored tanks was over. New anti-tank guns were making them death traps. The Soviet Union's own heavy tanks, like the bizarre multi-turreted T-35, were basically land battleships. They looked impressive in a parade, but they were slow, unreliable, and a complete nightmare to coordinate in a real fight. A totally new approach was needed. A team at the Kirov factory in Leningrad, led by Chief Engineer Joseph Kotin, designed a new heavy tank prototype. They named it after the tough-as-nails People's Commissar for Defense, Kliment Voroshilov. The new philosophy was simple: protection above all else. They got rid of the multiple turrets for one powerful turret, and then wrapped the whole thing in an insane amount of armor. The design was first battle-tested in the brutal Winter War against Finland in 1939. Its thick armor held up so well that, on Stalin's direct order, the KV-1 was rushed into production. It was a radical new direction, one that prioritized brute force and survivability over everything else.
What exactly made the KV-1 so terrifying in 1941? It was a simple combination of thick steel and a big gun. The early models had up to 75 millimeters of armor on the hull and turret, and later versions would be up-armored to as much as 110 millimeters. To give you some perspective, the most common German tank at the time, the Panzer III, had only about 30 millimeters of frontal armor. The standard German 37 millimeter anti-tank gun, nicknamed the Door Knocker, was completely useless against it. German gun crews could only watch in horror as their shells just ricocheted off the KV's hide, one after another. For firepower, the KV-1 carried a 76.2 millimeter gun, the same caliber found on the legendary T-34. But the KV-1 was a much more stable, survivable platform that could withstand a storm of enemy fire. Powering this 45-ton monster was a 550 to 600 horsepower diesel engine, which gave it a respectable top speed of around 35 kilometers per hour on a good day. But it was sluggish, and its wide tracks were designed to keep the massive tank from sinking into the ground. When German troops first ran into it, they had nothing that could reliably take it on. The KV-1's reputation wasn't just about its specs. It was built in the heat of battle. The most legendary story comes from June 1941, during the Battle of Rysini in Lithuania. As the German 6th Panzer Division was advancing, a single KV tank parked itself on their main supply road. Whether it had run out of fuel or broken down, we don't know for sure. But for nearly a full day, this one tank held up the advance of an entire German armored group. German accounts of the battle are just filled with desperation. They brought up a battery of 50 millimeter anti-tank guns. The KV knocked them out. They maneuvered an 88 millimeter flat gun into position, one of the few weapons that could kill a KV. The tank spotted it and destroyed it. At night, German combat engineers tried to sneak up and blow it up with explosive charges, but they only managed to damage its tracks. That single tank reportedly destroyed a dozen supply trucks and terrorized the German lines. It took a coordinated attack, using other tanks as a distraction, for another 88mm gun to finally knock it out from behind. The German soldiers were supposedly so impressed they buried the Soviet crew with full military honors. And that wasn't a one-off. In August 1941, near Leningrad, a lieutenant named Zinovy Kolobanov set up an ambush with 5 KV-1s. He hid his own tank on the edge of a swamp and waited. When a column of Panzers rolled into his trap, Kolobanov's gunner knocked out the first and last tanks, bottling them up. In just 30 minutes of chaos, Kolobanov's single tank destroyed 22 German tanks. In total, his small unit of 5 KV-1s racked up a kill count of 43 enemy tanks. When they examined his tank after the battle, they found over 150 dents in the armor where shells had hit but failed to penetrate. It's stories like these that made the KV-1 a true legend. If you're enjoying this dive into armored warfare history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We explore the machines, the battles, and the people that shaped modern warfare every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming up. But for all its thick armor, the KV-1 was not a perfect weapon. Its greatest strength, its weight, was also its greatest weakness. At 45 tons, and with later models getting even heavier, the KV-1 put a massive strain on its engine, and especially its transmission. The transmission was the tank's Achilles heel. It was horribly unreliable and so difficult to operate that drivers would sometimes use a hammer to shift gears. It's believed that in 1941, more KV-1s were simply abandoned by their crews due to mechanical breakdowns than were actually destroyed by the enemy. Life for the crew inside wasn't much better. The fighting compartment was cramped, visibility was awful, and the commander was completely overworked. And while its armor was great, German tactics quickly adapted. They learned to immobilize the slow-moving tanks by destroying their tracks, then call in air support or heavy artillery to finish the job. The final nail in the coffin was the arrival of better German guns. The high-velocity 7.5-centimeter gun on later Panzer IV models could punch through the KV-1's armor, and when the Tiger I appeared in late 1942, the KV-1 became totally obsolete. The Tiger's 88mm gun could kill a KV-1 from a distance where the KV couldn't hope to fight back. The Soviets saw the writing on the wall. They introduced the KV-1S, a lighter and faster version with thinner armor, but the age of the invincible KV was over.
So, what did the KV-1 leave behind? Its time on top was short, but its impact was massive. The shock of facing the KV-1 and the T-34 forced Germany into a frantic arms race. The development of the legendary Tiger and Panther tanks was a direct answer to the problem these Soviet tanks posed. This technological race to build bigger and deadlier tanks would define the rest of the war on the Eastern Front. For the Soviet Union, the KV-1 was a critical stepping stone. The lessons learned from its flawed design paved the way for the next generation of Soviet heavy tanks, the powerful Joseph Stalin, or IS series. The IS-2, the spiritual successor to the KV, would mount a massive 122mm gun and play a huge part in the final assault on Berlin. The KV-1 was a symbol of pure, stubborn resilience in the darkest days of 1941. It was flawed, unreliable, and frustrating, but for one critical moment in history, it was an almost indestructible beast that gave the Red Army a fighting chance and dealt a brutal psychological blow to an enemy that thought it couldn't be stopped.
From the drawing boards in Leningrad to that bloody crossroads in Lithuania, the story of the KV-1 is one of shock, adaptation, and brute force. It was a blunt instrument for a brutal war, a steel monster that bought the Soviet Union time it desperately needed. It was eventually surpassed, but its legend was forged in the panicked reports of German generals and the heroic last stands of its crews. The KV-1 proved that sometimes the sheer will to survive, embodied in 45 tons of steel, is enough to change the course of history.